Both VMware and Oracle are market leaders in virtualization. VirtualBox is Oracle's cross-platform virtualization software that can run multiple virtual machines, while Workstation Pro is VMware's 64-bit hosted hypervisor that has a lot of virtualization features for desktops. Today, in this video, I will be giving a detailed comparison between the different features of VirtualBox and VMware Workstation Pro. The first thing we will look at is licensing. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox are Type 2 hypervisors, which means they are installed on top of an existing operating system. But before you can run some of these Type 2 hypervisors, you would first need to have an installation key. That is true for VMware Workstation Pro, which requires a license to be able to run the hypervisor. And this license usually costs around 250 Canadian dollars. However, Oracle's VirtualBox is an open source software, which means it is free to use under the terms of the GNU General Public License version 2. Next will be the supported host operating systems. So for VMware Workstation Pro, you can only install it on either Windows or Linux machines. You will need another VMware product called VMware Fusion if you want to try virtualization on a Mac OS. On the other hand, VirtualBox is a cross-platform software, which means it can run on different operating systems like Windows, Linux, Mac OS, Oracle Solaris systems, and FreeBSD. Next will be the supported guest operating systems. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox supports multiple guest operating systems, which includes Windows, Linux, Solaris, and FreeBSD. The only difference is that VirtualBox allows you to install and run Mac OS guest operating systems, while VMware Workstation Pro doesn't. Next will be hardware and software virtualization. Hardware virtualization requires the hypervisor to emulate the host machine's hardware devices so that virtual machines can run directly on the processor of the host. This can only be done as long as the host machine has an Intel VTX or AMD V CPU and that hardware virtualization is enabled in UEFI or BIOS. Software virtualization, on the other hand, requires the host machine to emulate the entire computer system, which makes it slower in terms of performance compared to hardware virtualization. However, software virtualization is beneficial to host machines with older hardware. So for VMware Workstation Pro, it only supports hardware virtualization, while VirtualBox supports both hardware and software virtualization. Next will be optimizing virtual machines. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox have built-in tools or utilities that optimizes the performance of virtual machines. For VMware Workstation Pro, it comes with VMware Tools, which improves a virtual machine's performance and provides many features, while VirtualBox comes with guest additions to improve guest operating systems, performance and integration, and communication with the host machine. Both of these tools need to be installed after the guest operating system has been installed. Next, we will talk about snapshots. So a snapshot is a saved state of a virtual machine at a specific point in time. At any later time, you are able to return to the same state repeatedly. You can save multiple snapshots of your virtual machine as long as there is enough disk space on the host machine. Snapshots are usually used for backup and recovery. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox support VM snapshots. Next is 3D graphics support. Some applications you install in your guest operating system may need 3D rendering and acceleration. That is why you would need your hypervisor to have 3D graphics support. With VMware Workstation Pro, you get accelerated graphics and gaming support. With the DirectX 11 and OpenGL 4.1, you are able to allocate 8 GB of VRAM to guest VMs, which will improve gaming experience and performance of 3D apps. On the other hand, VirtualBox has a limited support for 3D graphics. It only supports up to OpenGL 3.0 and Direct3D 9. This feature of VirtualBox has been labeled as an experimental hardware 3D support. For this feature, VMware Workstation Pro clearly provides better 3D graphics support. Next, we will look at virtual networks in each hypervisor. Virtual networks are used by the hypervisor to connect networking components together. These are also referred to as virtual switches. VMware Workstation Pro supports three networking modes, which are NAT, bridge, and host-only networking. VirtualBox also supports those three networking modes, but aside from those three, it also supports internal, generic, UDP tunnel, and VDE networking. So in terms of virtual networks, VirtualBox provides more support. Next will be cloning virtual machines. Cloning is beneficial when you plan to deploy multiple virtual machines with the same configuration and setup. Since cloning is a lot faster than copying, thus you save time and effort. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox support linked and full clones. Linked clones are copies of a virtual machine and shares virtual disks with the parent virtual machine, while full clones are completely independent copies of a virtual machine and does not share anything with the parent VM. Next will be virtual disk allocation types. Normally, when you create a virtual disk, you would need to specify how this disk will be allocated. Both VMware Workstation Pro and VirtualBox supports two ways to allocate disk. First one is to allocate the entire disk during its creation. VMware Workstation Pro calls it thick provision disks, while VirtualBox calls it fixed disks. Another way is to allocate the disk gradually and increasing the disk size as data is written onto it. This disk allocation is called thin provisioned disks in VMware Workstation Pro, while VirtualBox calls it dynamically allocated disks. The last feature we will look at is migrating virtual machines. VMware Workstation Pro does not support any VM Live migration, although VMware does have this feature for migrating virtual machines, but is only available for ESXi hosts. VirtualBox, on the other hand, supports VM Live migration and calls it as teleporting. This feature allows moving a virtual machine over a network from one VirtualBox host to another while the virtual machine is running. Both VirtualBox and VMware Workstation Pro have some features that the other virtualization software may not have. VMware Workstation Pro has an advantage in terms of performance and 3D graphics. However, the difference between the two is not that noticeable. We have seen VirtualBox does have a lot of features that are comparable to VMware Workstation Pro. So that would be all for today's video, and thank you for listening.